Hello, everybody. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah,
we can.
Excellent. Thank you. That's great. I am just counting up the number of people we have. I think 14 different computers have joined so far. We're expecting, I think, 24 people, something of that order. I know some of you are grouped together. So there's a bunch in Putney, I think. Adam and Jonathan, and I can't remember, is that Adrian? I think you're together in Putney. Welcome all. I think it's probably a good plan if we just turn off the audio, if you don't mind, just at the beginning particularly, so we don't have too much interference. And the plan is, well, everyone gathers, we're, first of all, welcome and thank you very much for joining. It's really great to see you all. Some of you are long-standing supporters of ours, and some of you are relatively recent discoverers. And it's really lovely to have so many people together, all of whom appreciate Les Genoux, which is a lovely wine. And I think this is a rare opportunity to get to taste through a range of them. And hopefully we'll find it interesting. And what I thought I'd do is talk for, I've got a few slides. I always find it hard not to put together quite a lot of slides because there's lots to tell you. We can skip through them, but I thought I would take you through that for 15 or 20 minutes before we get closely involved in the tasting. Amanda is going to join us a little bit later. She's out at a leaving do, so hopefully she'll be here with us before 8, quarter to 8, something like that, and we'll just say hello. And we're aiming to finish before 8:30, so you can get away and eat. If you ask a lot of questions, then some of us can stay on a bit longer, but anyone who feels that they'd like to drift off anywhere between 8 and 8:30, they're very welcome to do so. Just admitting the last couple of people. Hello, Alex. I think you've just joined us. I had a couple of people say that they actually can't make it. They're delayed. David Irwin in Belfast, unfortunately, has lost his sense of smell due to COVID, so he's desperately hoping it's going to come back. Oh, in fact, you're here, David, aren't you? I think I can see you. Yes. Welcome. Nice to see you. I don't know if you're going to taste or whether you're going to keep the samples for a week and try and taste with the recording. We are recording this just to make sure you're aware, because again, a couple of people said they'd like to watch the recording. So I hope that's okay with everyone. I did warn you in advance. I hope it is. So don't say anything incriminating if you don't want to be recorded doing that. But look, I think we're almost all here now, which is fabulous, and lovely to see so many faces. And I know that my friend Chris George, Chris, are you with us? I don't know. I can't see you. He was called to Belfast again, I think, and tried to post himself for samples in order that they could arrive. He couldn't carry them in his hand luggage in order they could arrive in time for him to be there, but he may not have.
He's training in Trinity College, Dublin. He's training in Dublin. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I know, John, he invited you.
They confiscate the samples on the plane over.
Did they?
That's what he was worried about. That may have happened, but we'll find out.
I think he tried to post them in the hope that they wouldn't confiscate them, but I think the chances of them having arrived in the 2 days he left to post them are fairly slim, so he may or may not join us. But George, very nice to see you and welcome. Look, lovely to all be here. So I think let us make a start, because it's now 4 minutes past 7. And I'm going to start by just sort of telling you a little bit about the story of Domaine of the Bee and how we started and Les Genoux and how it originated. My friend Patrick should be joining us, but don't see that he's here now, and he's quite instrumental in the story. But I'm going to share some slides which I just put together, so bear with me while I find them. Hopefully I've got 2 open that appear to be the same, but let's try that. Share. Right, can you all now see that front slide? Good, a few nods, that's great. Here we are with the bottles. So obviously I prepared these. I prepared some for, I don't know if Kieran, are you with us, Kieran? Just do unmute and say hello if you are. Can't hear Kieran, but he was jetting off somewhere abroad, and I managed to prepare a set of samples for him to send to him before they got to him, but the rest I prepared a week later. And this is the kitchen where I am now with the bottles lined up. You might notice if you're eagle-eyed that the last 2 bottles are taller and less wide than the previous 4. We started off thinking this is a premium wine, we've got to put it in a heavy bottle. But thanks to lots of pressure from various people in the wine industry, including Jancis Robinson and Tamlin, who's actually joining us tonight. So Tamlin Curran, who writes for Jancis, we're very lucky to have joining us, and she might share her thoughts a bit later on. They are powerful advocates for lightweighting bottles, not having very, very heavy bottles, because 30 or 35% of the carbon footprint of any bottle of wine is just the glass in which it comes. So if we can use 30% less glass, than you actually save on 30% of the energy, because the energy is what's put in to melt the glass. So we've gone for slightly lighter bottles, taller but thinner bottles in the last couple of vintages. You also might notice the middle 2 haven't got little beveled edges, and that was just a failure to check the proofs properly at this stage of signing off the dry goods, and they went with straight edges, which I was annoyed about the first year, and then really annoyed the second year when I failed to spot it on the proofs. So we've gone back to the deckled edges for the following vintages, and I thought I'd take a photograph of the. Hang on, it's done this odd thing sometimes. It freezes. So a photograph with a light box of the bottles. And you probably noticed this as you poured them, that there's a little bit of color variation. It's quite a strong light shining from behind through quite a thin bottle. But they're relatively pale colored wines, and something we can get into a little bit later on about the mix of grapes, and also the way the winemaking has changed, which is perhaps producing slightly lighter styles. And that 2018 is probably the lightest coloured of all. So quite interesting to see. And the 17 is probably the darkest. So we might, as we taste through, we might just remember that. So just want to take you all the way back. Amanda and I went on holiday in 2003, and we met these 2 English guys and really liked them, and said, one day we'd like to own a vineyard. And they called up a couple of months later, and I was in the vineyard in February in 2004 thinking, well, I could buy this vineyard, why not? Eventually decided to buy it. This is the vineyard that produces Les Genoux. It's in the Cuvée, and for the first 3 years, we didn't make any wine from our grapes. We gave them to our friends Richard and Mark. And then so in January 2006, we bottled a few bottles that were wines that contained our grapes. So these were not entirely our grapes, but Richard and Mark had blended our Grenache with their Grenache and our Carignan with their Carignan. And we took the best barrel that had the highest percentage of our grapes in it, of each grape, made a blend, made about 250 bottles, and hand bottled them. That's my son Sam standing at the back. And the guy on the right is actually another vigneron in the village who had a little bottling, hand bottling setup. So we went there and hand bottled them. And this is my son Sam trying to mimic the Henri Cartier-Bresson photograph. Having just bottled them, we then walked them down to the cafe and pulled the cork on them again and had them with a steak. And that was a very gratifying moment. And a few of you may have remembered buying our 2004, which is a sort of prototype Domaine of the Bee. We had it unlabeled for a long time, and then we printed up some 2004 Domaine of the Bee labels to sort of, as we bottled the 2007, in fact, just to show what it was like from 3 years old. So that was how we started. And then the first couple of years, we started 2007 was the first vintage we made. 2007 and 2008 were entirely all the wines we'd made, all the different wines from different vineyards, all blended together to make one wine. And then this is where my friend Patrick comes in. Patrick, do speak up if you're there. I can only see a small panel of you because I'm doing the presentation, so I've got 4 or 5 of you on the side. I can't see everyone. Patrick may not have managed to join us, but he went on holiday, actually when we weren't there, and went to visit Richard, tasted all the barrels, and was particularly excited about 1 or 2 of the barrels that came from the Cuvée vineyard. And he'd been visiting Hervé Bizet, who makes the most expensive wine in the Roussillon, which is called the Petit Sibéry. And he thought our Genoux barrels were pretty much up to scratch with Petit Sibéry, which is 200 euros a bottle. So we were very encouraged. Patrick is an old friend, and he's the one who got me involved in wine in the first place. So we have him to blame for everything you're tasting. And so he encouraged me that the wine was good enough to think about bottling as a separate bottling. So in 2011, we hand bottled the 2009 vintage. You can see it's a very primitive process. There's the top left picture, there's a siphon hose coming out of the barrel. and 3 little sort of filling heads, which you just swap from one bottle to the next, and theoretically they stop when the bottle is full. But there's a bit of topping up required, as you can see bottom right. I'm just adjusting the levels, and then we're putting in corks by hand. It's very much a family affair. And we made 260 odd bottles of Les Genoux 2009 as an experiment, really, just to see if this wine on its own tasted good enough. And we really thought it did. And we had a few eager fans at the beginning who loved it. So we were encouraged. And we thought from then on, when we think we have a barrel or possibly 2 barrels that are good enough from that vineyard, we'll bottle a Les Genoux blend. And so we've done that most years. 2010, 2011, we bottled a Les Genoux. We didn't in 2012, and we didn't in 2014, but I think and 16. So 12, 14, and 16, we didn't make any, but otherwise every vintage we have managed to make some. And what we're tasting today is the 13, 15, and then 17, 18, 19, 20, as you know. Just to picture where we are, we're in the village of Morey. That's sort of the base, if you like, and all our vineyards are scattered around Morey. This particular little side shoot, you can see, the valley floor is covered in little squares of vineyard, and the rocks and the hillsides are dark green and rocky. So where the vineyards are, this is a little side shoot of the main valley in Morey, and it's called the Cumbe de Roi, which means the Valley of the King, or the Cumbe del Rei in sort of Catalan. And it's considered rather a high quality little sort of sub-appellation of Morey. One day we think possibly might be, when Morey has a more detailed system like Burgundy of identifying the best vineyards, we hope that the Cumbe de Roi will be considered among the best. And so we bought this plot in the Cumbe de Roi, and we call it the Cumbe de Roi plot because it's our only plot in the Cumbe de Roi, but obviously every other vineyard in the valley calls it the Cumbe de Roi, and they've all got their own names for that plot. And its vines are incredibly old. This one on the bottom right that you can see is the vine that is on the side of the road, and the most magnificent looking vine. As we drive past, we always take a photograph. So I've got 400 photographs of Hector at various different stages of the season. And it's quite nice putting them together and showing a kind of the life of Hector in the last 10 or 15 years, 15 plus years that we've owned the vineyard. From above, it looks like this. And you can see the little dots of the vines, and the gaps are the rows. And I'm just going to show you, when you buy land in France, you have something called the cadastre, which is it's held at the mairie, and it's the plan of all the plots of land that are owned by anyone. And you can see vineyard blocks are subdivided into lots of little subplots. And I think the typical reason for this is that when people in France die and pass on their land, it has to be divided equally between their children. And this is the Napoleonic law of succession. And therefore, parcels of land are subdivided into plots, and then often accumulated back up again. And, people swap their plots, or they marry and they consolidate their vineyard holdings, so they're manageable. But you've got all these different plots. So we own the stuff surrounded by the green, and the little red bits are all a house that is subdivided into several little sections. Actually, no, the house is on the left, the ruin bit, and then there's a little parcel of land that several people own. And I actually tried to go about buying the other parts, because I thought it would make quite a nice bit to replant next to our plot 143. So that's where that bit comes from. I also end up ripping out the vines in the red sections, because actually there's one red section we didn't. I don't know if I can move my mouse so you can see it. Is that visible?
Yes.
There's a mouse moving over that section. So we never ripped that section out. We decided it was good enough. It had a stay of execution, so it's still there. And I think the next slide is the tractor rows. So when we arrived, we had 9 rows of vines between each tractor row, which meant it really hard to actually get any treatments against fungal disease into the middle rows. So we always found we got the middle 2 or 3 rows ended up with being a home for oidium, or one of the mildew fungal diseases. And so we decided we were going to rip out that middle row, which obviously reduced our number of vines by just over 1/10. But we've ended up with better yields ever since, because we can now look after the vineyard properly and make sure we get a good yield from every vine. So look, I would suggest, while you're listening, if you fancy having a sip, then please don't let me stop you. Make sure there's enough left in your glass of each wine, so that when we'll come to talk about one wine after another, there is enough to consider what you've got left in your glass. I poured about half of my bottle out. So
which one do you recommend we start with, Justin?
So we'll start with the oldest, the 13, and we'll move towards the youngest. Different people have got different ideas about how to taste. I don't mind doing it either way, but I think it's quite interesting to talk chronologically and sort of talk about the development of the style, because I think it has evolved quite a bit. And this is just a graph I put in an email about a year ago, which is sort of harvest dates, just to give you an idea of when we harvest. So we actually harvest this year the earliest ever. So 2022 was harvested on the 20th of September, the first day, and then the second day, the very next day. So we picked really 2/3 of our grapes in the first 2 days, and then the last vineyard on the 29th of September. So we've a couple of years we've finished before the start of October. So 2011 and 2017 were 2 years where everything was very early. And it's usually a good sign. Those 2 years, 11 and 17, are two of the best we've made. And often the later years, 13 and 14, are notable as being quite late years, not such good quality. We're waiting to try and get the grapes ripe. That tends to be why we haven't yet picked. And if the grapes aren't quite yet ripe, hang on, there's one person who's just arrived in. Nick and Jeanette, you've just arrived. So sorry if I had a little while to admit you. I was focusing on...
Sorry, we were very tardy.
Don't worry. Well, nice to see you, and thank you for joining us. We're just having a little scroll through the different years since we started, and we're looking at the harvest dates. And so sort of correlating that actually late harvests generally aren't very good, but you've got more threat of rain later into October. You've got more hang time for the wild boar to start eating them. You've got chance for another generation of Domaine, which is a moth that lays its eggs in the bunches of grapes, and they have 3 or 4 generations. And if you let the 4th generation go rampant, then you lose your crop. And that's pretty much what happened in 2014. We lost over half our grapes to Domaine and sort of acetic sour rot. That's the only disastrous year we've had. We've had a few less good years and a few really good years. So I put the ones I think are really good years in green, but actually that doesn't correlate entirely with the quality of the Les Genoux that we're going to be tasting. So maybe Les Genoux, that vineyard is an exception. Hang on. There we go. I also thought I'd just share the yield. So this is a plot. There's a 1.8 hectare plot, and we pulled out the red bits, which reduces the planted area to about 1.4 hectares. And we get a terrible yield from this plot. And we really should rip it out, because the average in France is 58 hectolitres a hectare across all the regions of France. Most of the quality regions are below 50, 45, 40. It's typical in Bordeaux. The Rhône might be 25 to 35 as a typical yield. The Roussillon region average is about 27. We at Domaine of the Bee across all 3 of our blocks, I actually can't read the number there, it's 11 point something, I think. Yeah, 11.5 is our overall average yield over the 14-15 years we've been farming. And this particular block, the Cuvée d'Oie, averages 7.3 hectolitres, which is really, really low. So that's 730 litres per hectare. So effectively about 1,000 litres for this 1.4 hectare vineyard, which is 2 500-litre barrels. So you're farming a huge area, and you're having a lot of cost and hassle and effort and pruning just to get 1,000 litres of wine. So I don't want you all to feel sorry for me. We keep doing it because we think this particular vineyard produces amazing quality, and the wines are worth it. But the economic argument is not really strong. However, 2022, this year, we just had an absolutely amazing yield. It was nearly double what it had ever been before, and close to 3 times the average. And we put that down to a really good flowering. So we often have wet and windy weather in flowering season, and flowers are very sensitive, and old Grenache vine flowers are extremely sensitive. And if they don't like what they're experiencing when they start to flower, over the week or 10 days it takes for the flower to be pollinated, they're wind pollinated rather than insect pollinated. They need to be pollinated, they need to set. And that fruit set is what fails very often. And you get little grapes that look promising, tiny little pinhead sized grapes that just fall off a few days later. You can shake the flowers and half or 3/4 of the little grapes fall off, and you end up with a sketchy bunch or no bunch at all. And that's a very common problem. But 2022, we hardly had that problem. We had 80 or 90% of the bunches set quite nicely. So that's the main reason that the yield is excellent. And we had enough water over the harvest that even that very dry period in the summer didn't cause us problems. So one other thing I might mention is that the last 4 or 5 years, we've been buying a really expensive American oak barrel from Seguin Moreau. It's called an Icon, and they specially select the wood, very tight grained wood, and they do it. We ask them to do a very long, slow toasting. So it's not toasted to a high level. You don't get a lot of toast, sort of burnt wood flavor, which you get on some barrels. And it's burnt very slowly, so you don't get it sort of subtly impregnates the wood and gives it we think a delicious flavor. And then the oak, even though some of these wines, most of these wines from about 17 onwards certainly are more than 50% new oak, but we don't think the wine really shows it. They're not very noticeably oaky, and we don't really want an oaky flavored red. And it's quite a delicate style of wine, this, so we're not looking for huge amount of oak. So these barrels are, I think, quite important to the flavour of the wine. The one thing to observe is that they're normally about 100 to 150 euros more expensive than the regular French oak barrels, which are 12 or 1300, and these are 13, 1400. This year, that barrel was 1740 euros for no obvious reason. They just put the price up, and we ordered them a bit late, so I didn't have much negotiating power at that point. So I just paid up. And I'm just a bit worried that they're going to keep on getting more and more expensive, because they really are good barrels. Anyway, moving on. I think it's probably time to start tasting the first wine. So why don't we all have a good nose and a taste of our 2013. So just one, and you're welcome to write any notes you want, or say, it's a good idea to collect some thoughts, and in a structured way, if you have a piece of paper, just write down, the difference between the wines, what you think, and I think we'll just open the floor to any comments. But just an observation: these little bottles, they're great, and when I hand bottle them, I do them extremely carefully. I make sure I fill them as full as possible to leave as little oxygen space as possible. But there's always a risk. I opened some that were kind of 6 months old, and they were definitely all a little bit oxidized. So when you open a bottle of wine and you pour it into another bottle, you introduce a little bit of oxygen. And because I did these all about 10 days ago, there shouldn't be any discernible oxidation. But this first wine is beginning to show the signs of age. I think it's just a hint of the fact that the fact that all the other wines seem fine is probably just this wine is getting over or to the point of where it's certainly not going to improve. It's probably going to decline from now on. So what I notice when I smell it, and it may be just my sample, is that there's a slightly sort of cooked smell about it, which makes me think it's a little bit going a bit over the hill. But it's got some quite intriguing sort of licoricey notes. One of the herbs that grows around our vineyard a lot is fennel, and we often think that we can smell things in wine that come from the aromatic plants that grow around the vineyard. And we have a lot of rosemary, a lot of thyme, and quite a bit of fennel, particularly around this vineyard. So sometimes we think we find some licorice smells and flavors in the wine. I think this one possibly has a bit of that. So what do we think about the taste? And please, if you've got something interesting to say, and I think that probably happens more as the tasting wears on, when we've all had a bit of a chance to compare 1 or 2 wines and had a glass or 2 of wine. But do chip in if you've got an observation or a question.
Can I ask a question, please? And this is generally, and by the way, that it's delicious. Has COVID and the fact that we had the lockdown and huge difference in air pollution, I'm imagining it'd be a bit of a lag time into how that pollution or reduced pollution impregnated the soil. But are you expecting that to make a difference, or have you already noticed that?
So I would probably say that around us, I'm not aware that there's a significant air pollution issue, because it's a fairly rural area. The nearest sort of conurbation is Perpignan, and that's really isolated. It's not a huge town. I don't know the population, but it's maybe 200,000. It's got a little bit of industry, but it's not pumping out large plumes of smoke into the air. I mean, there's more pollution perhaps from wildfires than anything else. So I don't think and traffic, there's not a lot of people driving past, so there's not that much traffic. I don't think I've noticed any discernible effect, and I wouldn't know how to measure the effect of air pollution on vineyard soils. The only places I know that that's probably been studied is, there's a few vineyards right slap bang next to motorways. Around Bordeaux, some of those roads cut through quite well-known vineyards, and in the Rhone Valley, big roads drive past the Hermitage slopes and the Côte Rôtie. So I think probably some universities have studied the kind of heavy metals that might come from vehicle pollution. But where we are, it's really not an issue, I don't think. And there's certainly no one with a budget to pay scientists to study their soils, because it's a very poor area.
Well, I visited Sonoma a few years ago, just after their enormous wildfires,
Yes.
and actually going on the wine tasting courses there before and after the wildfire. It was extraordinary, the difference.
Yes, well, they have a particular problem, and in Australia or anywhere where there's large fires, with something called smoke taint. So I talked about the smell of aromatic plants potentially affecting the flavour of wine. And the mechanism for that is that the skin of the grape, that kind of slightly waxy, you see a grape, it's not shiny, it's slightly matte and waxy. And if you can scrape it off with your thumb and it shines up, that dissolves aromatic compounds. It's very well known that if you've got eucalyptus trees growing near a vineyard, your wine will smell of eucalyptus, because the oils dissolve in the waxy coat of the grape and then transmit into the wine. And that's certainly true of the flavour of smoke. You've got lots of smoke drifting past a vineyard in the month or so before the harvest, when the grapes are starting to form that waxy coat, then you will get taint flavours. If the vines are very young and the grapes are tiny, it probably won't have much effect. But whole vineyards have thrown away entire productions that they just haven't bottled because of smoke taint.
Can I ask another question about your vines? You mentioned their age. Are they all the same age, or does it vary from plot to plot? And how old are they on average?
Well, good question. We have 3 plots. One of the plots is almost entirely consistent and planted probably all at the same time. But even then, I mean, so our vineyards are effectively about 65, about 80, 85, and over 100. But the over 100-year-old plots, as you plant a vineyard, you find some vines will fail, and you will fill in the gap with a younger vine. And if it's in the first 3 or 4 years, it's negligible, the difference. But if you've got a 30-year-old vineyard and you've got some gaps, and then you plant some younger vines, you've obviously got some vines in there that are quite a bit younger than the other ones. So we don't know, because we have no records of this particular vineyard. We bought it from someone who we don't know how long they'd owned it. Certainly not that long, because they're a sort of fairly recent comer to the area. And I don't know who owned it before that. And they wouldn't have kept records in those days. In fact, if you look at the cadastre and some of the information, a lot of the vines apparently were planted in 1949. That was just the year they started asking people when the vines are planted. And if they went, oh, I don't know, well, I think they started in the 60s or 70s, and they just thought, well, if it's old, let's just call it 1949. We won't try and work out which year it was. So there's a lot of vineyards that say 1949, but actually 1920 or 1912 or 1932. But yes, most of the vines, we got no young vines at all. There's no vines younger than 40 years old, I don't think. But there might be some that were infilled by previous vignerons. And we do have a lot of very heterogeneous vineyards, and this particular vineyard has got all sorts of varieties, all co-planted, because that's how they used to do things in those days. Amanda's just returned.
Hello.
She's just going to get rid of her bike gear, have a glass of water, and then we'll probably come and hover around in the background and make sensible comments. Actually,
Can I ask a quick question about, you mentioned about the barrels and the cost going up per year. Do you not reuse, ignorance here, do you not reuse your barrels?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
We have the need for somewhere in the region of 15 to 20 barrels a year, partly because we ferment in open barrels, and then we, as much as we can, close them up and use them to store wine in. And obviously last year's wine is stored in barrels as we're fermenting in some other barrels. So we actually borrow some open barrels from Jean Marc to ferment in, because we don't want to open all of our barrels and then have to close them quickly again to fill them with wine. But every year we buy between 2 and 3 new barrels. And that is because a barrel after about 10 years gets to the point where it's starting to smell a bit, or it got some hygiene problems. And advisable, once the barrel gets to a point where it's not adding value and there's no oak flavour coming, and there's something that's perhaps slightly negative about the flavour because of hygiene issues or it smells a bit volatile, you retire it. So we occasionally bring barrels over here and sell them. We sometimes bring barrel staves over here. Some of you have probably got a barrel stave that I've forced you to take. If you came to our house and bought a couple of cases of wine and were a club member, you probably had a barrel stave pressed into your hands. If you haven't, if you want one, I have got a few spares. But yes, we do retire them when they get to about 10 years old. So every wine that we have, so these wines will have a mixture of 1 year old, new 1 year old, 2 year old, 3 year old, 4 year old barrels. And even so, you know, some of the ones that are 10 years old are now left open so that we can just every year use them as an open barrel to ferment in, and then we just keep them. Closing a barrel is quite complicated, and you can only do it a few times before you wear out. You have to take all the hoops off and then take the head out, put the hoops back in, fill it with grapes, ferment in it. Then that's finished. You have to take the grapes out, clean it conspicuously really well. Then you have to take all the hoops off, put the head back in, put the hoops back on, make sure it's sealed and doesn't leak, and then you can carry on using it. And after 3 or 4 times of that, you sometimes break enough of the wood that it's impossible to do without it leaking. So at that point, we move it into an open barrel and keep it for a few more years. And then when we decide it's really past its best, we will retire it. I actually sold 4 barrels to a Canadian whiskey company a year and a half ago. And if anyone's keen on bourbon style Canadian whiskey, there will be a Domaine of the Bee barrel blend in, I don't know, 10 years time. When it comes out, I'll let you all know and you can buy some if you want. So any more comments about the 2013 before we move on?
Just you wrote on the notes that drinking window 2015 to 2022, and I want to say that I think that this wine is staggeringly beautiful and alive for a 2013, and I would push that drinking date way up. I don't, it has not anywhere near come to the end of its drinking window. There is so much life.
Well, Tamlin, thank you. That's great to hear. I'll just explain that when I wrote down the drinking windows when we first launched the wine, and we've got, and you know, one of the joys of this kind of tasting is we actually get a bunch of people together who all know the wine, enjoy the wine, and have the wine in their cellar and have the real experience of drinking it themselves over time to kind of share thoughts about how long it might last. And when you're starting out, you've just got no idea how long your wine's going to go for, and you don't want to a couple of things. You don't want to overpromise and get people to keep their wine until it's past its best. And secondly, you want to sell wine every year. You don't want people to fill their cellar and never drink a bottle. Because drinking a bottle is usually what makes people come back and buy another one. So I would happily keep this wine a little bit longer, and I will keep some bottles another 10 years and see how they age. But you know, one of the outputs in this tasting will be let's decide if we all agree on the drinking window, or actually we might just have different tastes and like wines at different ages. So I'm very open to keeping this a bit longer, but I wouldn't advise people to do that if they find that. I mean, I'm wondering if Tammy, did you pick up any oxidation on your sample, or is it just mine that tastes a little bit?
No, there's no oxidation on my sample. It's tasting really beautiful right now. There's a kind of a cross between, for me, a little bit of old Pinot Noir and old Chateauneuf du Pape. It's kind of got elements of both. It's a wine that I would say drink now, but I think it's got so much life in it that if you left it another couple of years or 3 years or whatever, it's still going to be fine. It's still going to be beautiful. I think it's going to hold, is probably what I would say. It's at a beautiful place. I think it's going to hold quite easily for years to come. I wouldn't keep it to develop, but I think it's. But then I'm looking that you only made 950 bottles, so I can't imagine you have many left.
No, we have none for sale. I always keep sort of a couple of cases in France as a sort of library.
Yeah,
I try and keep a few bottles in my house here in London as library stock, but I think I've very few left of that. In fact, when I put together the bottles for this tasting, I realized I needed 4 of each wine in order to bottle them up to have 28 sets. And I realized I only had 3 bottles of 2005, I think it was, or was it? Yeah, 2005. Sorry, 2015. And I was thinking, oh, damn, I'm going to have to limit the number of tastings or go and buy one back from one of my customers. But it turned out I had a look in a wine rack and found 1 more bottle. So that's the only bottle I have here. And I have 15 or so in France, 12 or 15. I'll bring a couple back next time I come back, just so I've got something here. But yes, they are limited in number. And I'd be interested to know how many of you, and I can't see all of you, so you'll have to speak rather than put your hand up. How many of you think they've still got some 2013 in their cellar?
Yes, definitely.
Few yeses. George, Chris, I think, has some. Yeah. So, you know, some of you have been following this wine for quite a long time.
I can say.
Sorry. And, you know, I don't know if you're early drinkers or keepers. You know, I encounter some people who go, oh, I put all your wine in the cellar and I'm keeping it 10 years before I open a bottle. And other people have all, you know, I sell them some 2020 and they ring me up saying, I finished it all, can I have some more? And I love both types of customer, it's fair to say, as long as the people who keep buying it every year and, you know, drinking it over time. Let's move on. I'm just conscious of time, so let's move on to the 15. Just wondering if I've got any other things to tell you about the vintage.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, I just did this slide because I took a nice little time-lapse video of the 2013 harvest, and there is a link here if you're interested. I could send you this presentation afterwards, just if you wanted to watch the progress of the pickers through the vineyard over about 3 or 4 hours. Quick recap of the 2014 harvest. This is the year we had the problem with eau de mise, and you can see this bunch. You know, there's barely an untouched grape. There's sort of the blacker looking ones that appear to be whole and round are reasonably sound, but the ones that are crumpled and a bit red have got a little caterpillar living inside them. And you know that you have to show the pickers this is a bunch you can't put in the basket and police that quite carefully, because it's difficult to control 12 or 15 pickers unless you're really sort of on their case. But you know, we had a problem that year, and bunches like that we left on the ground, and bunches with 4 or 5 grapes that were affected we picked, and then we tried to pull the grapes off before we put them into the vat. So we lost about half the fruit altogether, which is a bit of a shame. Okay, on to the 15. The number of bottles we make each year varies depending on the volume that we bottle. We tend to use nowadays mostly 500 litre barrels, but we also have some 225 litre barrels, and that's the standard kind of Bordeaux barrique size. So we're often bottling 1 500 and 1 225, which means we've got 725 litres. If you're really good and don't have the wine with lots of sediment in it, you can bottle over 1,000 bottles. But when we fail to bottle 1,000 bottles, it's because there's been a lot of sediment and we've lost a bit in the filter, and that's the only number we actually end up bottling. And every time you change from one wine to the next, you have 30 or 40 bottles in between that are a mixture of the two, so you have to put them aside. That's what we drink at home often, or house drinking. But so 909 bottles of this technically made. Smelling quite youthful, this one, a bit more so than the last one. And quite a powerful wine. I think this one, it says 15. I prepared these slides quite quickly, and I might have failed to change that from the previous slide. It might be 14.5. But in the earlier days, these wines were more alcoholic. And you know, that's one of the things I think we can discuss is what that sort of slight change of style in winemaking has done, and whether we like that the younger wines as much or more than we do the older ones. But this is a really good vintage, 2015. I think Domaine of the Bee is absolutely lovely in that vintage, tasting really nice now. And I think this is tasting pretty good too. Tamlin certainly enjoyed it. It got a 92 in decanter. We don't have a big budget to enter our wine into competitions very often, so we're quite selective about what we enter and when we enter it. It costs 120 to 150 quid per wine to enter a competition, and you need 4 bottles. And you know, if you get a gold medal, that's quite worthwhile. If you get a bronze medal, it's not quite so worthwhile. So we try and enter when we think we've got a good chance of a silver or a gold. And yes, Decanter obviously tasted it this year and scored it 92 out of 100, which is kind of silver, middle silver quality. And that's a pretty good score in this day and age. And Tamlin, Tamlin, it'd be interesting to talk to you about Jancis and the website and the different tasters who taste for Jancis and how you align your palates, because there are different preferences, aren't there? Some of you like certain styles better than others, and Jancis herself is quite mean with her scoring. Is that fair to say?
Yes, probably more mean than, although I say she's more mean than I am. I think it depends on what we're looking at. She's very mean when it comes to Burgundy and Bordeaux,
Yeah.
the classics, and very generous when it comes to, I guess, the outlier areas, regions. I think that I'm probably more straight across the board. I'm generous with wines that I think are honest and beautiful and drink beautifully, and I'm quite mean with maybe we all judge, don't we? And I think that wines that are massively expensive, I judge harshly is the word. Because I think if we're paying thousands of pounds or hundreds of pounds a bottle, then you need to earn your score.
Definitely. I mean, it's an interesting concept, the idea of scoring wine, because do you take every film you watch and reduce it to a number, or every friend you have, have they got a score hovering above their head when you see them? Do you have dinner parties for your 95 and above friends? It's a slightly false premise that you can give a wine a score and treat that as a sort of fact about the wine. It's an opinion, and it's an opinion based on time, isn't it? And one of the nice things I like that you do is every time you or someone else rates a wine, it gets a different score, because that particular bottle tastes the way it did that day, and you're not necessarily trying to say that that's a fact about the wine. It's the experience of tasting it on that day.
Yeah, but also I think that we make it quite clear at jancisrobinson.com that we don't believe in scores, we believe in tasting notes. And that really read the tasting note, not the score. The score is kind of the guide, but the score is very personal, and no matter what anyone will tell you, we're not doing mathematical equations here. It's not science. And you cannot, I mean, nobody scores books, nobody scores art, nobody scores music. So to score wine is kind of moving into the realm of the ridiculous, thanks to Robert Parker, because prior to that, we didn't really score wine. We talked about wine. Anyway, it is what it is. We're scoring. We have to score. Scores are very personal. But I would always say to everybody, look at the tasting notes. That's really what counts. So scores give you a ballpark about whether you should buy the wine or not, whether it's amazing or just good. But the tasting notes tell you about whether it's going to be a wine that you love or not.
Well, I totally agree. And I find I do score things because you at least have to put a stake in the ground and say, how much did you like this wine? Where do you rate it on a scale? And you may have a different view next time you taste it, but it's quite helpful to say, I actually gave that wine a 17 and I gave that wine a 15. And you can read the note and not know that from the notes as to how much you liked it. So I find them quite useful, but I take them with a big pinch of salt, put it like that, because it's such a personal thing. Someone might say to you, Reservoir Dogs is the greatest film ever made, but if you don't like violent films, then you're going to hate it. And it doesn't.
Exactly.
Yeah. Amarone is the sort of horror film of the wine world. And if you don't like, 16% monstrously alcoholic port-like, slightly sweet Italian reds, then you're going to hate it. It doesn't. Someone gives it 100 doesn't mean you're going to like it. It's a different style.
The one thing I wanted to ask about the 2015 is that tasting it now, it tastes a little bit more oaky than the 2013. Did you have a different oak aging regime for the 13 versus the 15?
I knew you were going to start asking difficult questions like that, Tamlin. If I had an ideal world where I had a day to prepare for this tasting, I'd have looked up all my notes and just had chapter and verse on every barrel that these wines went into. We weren't open barrel fermenting in 2015, so we are putting straight into a new or a older oak barrel, and I don't have in my head a record of which this particular wine went into. We can see from the number of bottles it was a 500 litre barrel and a 225. The 225 wouldn't have been new. The 500 probably was new, so it's probably 70% new oak.
At that point, would it have been American or French?
We use only French oak for the Grenache, and we started introducing an American barrel for the Carignan about 5 years ago. So a little bit of American oak for the Carignan, which I think those for the grape I prefer. Well, I think Carignan takes American oak very well, whereas I don't think it suits Grenache particularly. So that's just my impression from what I've tasted.
And
yes, Amanda's giving me the timekeeper signal, so we're going to crack on because we've halfway through, but only a third of the way through the wines. But having said that, we'd had a long preamble before you got here, which is not about wine tasting, so we're all right. We're going to catch up. Let us move to the 2017. Well, here are some pictures of the 2015 vintage. This is where I started doing very earnest pieces to camera in the hope that someone was one day going to watch them, but I forgot to post most of them, and the ones I didn't get an enormous number of views. And when you're trying to do everything from understanding what's going on in the vineyard to trying to sell the bottles and stock take and order dry goods, you have to choose where to spend your time, and I don't spend a lot of my time doing the kind of social media side of things. Probably a good thing. So those are some photos from 2015, and yeah, along the top and to the right we've got the lovely family who actually spend, that they are the family who live in the valley, who work for Jean-Marc Lafarge, but they are in charge of our vine blocks. They have about 40 or 50 hectares to look after, which is quite a lot, but they have a tractorist who comes in and helps. So Edmund drives the tractor, and they have someone else who comes in when they're busy. But they are responsible on a day-to-day basis for kind of looking after our plots, and they're lovely folk, and we get on very well with them, and they're Portuguese and really hardworking and lovely people. Really lovely. So on to the 17. We started inching the price up as we got some plaudits, and actually it was the 2011 was the first vintage that we thought, no, this is worth a bit more. We got some really good scores for it, and we sold it for 45 quid. And then we came to the 13, and I think the 15, I had a sort of slight panic about the price. Actually, that's not one. And put it back to 35 quid. But then more recently, as more people have discovered the wine and thought, actually, we really like this wine, and compared to other wines at that kind of price point from Châteauneuf-du-Pape or from Priorat or from Australia, other Grenaches, or Pinot Noirs from Burgundy, a bottle of our wine actually really seems to stack up well at the price point. So we charge 45 quid now and 36 to Wine Club members. And we do have a ready audience for it. And we are selling slightly more than we're making at the moment, which is alarming me a little bit.
That's not possible.
It is. Because you start off by making more than you're selling. And then you have stock, and the stock builds up, and then you start to sell more than you make, and the stock goes down again. Okay. And we're reaching the point where we've got not much left, and we're only going to bottle one 500 litre barrel of the 2021 vintage, so 660 bottles if we're lucky, and that we'll sell 900 bottles this year, which will be everything. So we'll have almost no bottles of Les Genoux left at the end of this time next year. But the good news is the 2022 vintage, which you saw on the graph at the beginning, because it's so big, we might have even 3 barrels to bottle. So we'll have a big, well, I haven't decided yet. It's obviously way too early to decide that kind of thing, but we'll have a lot of material to choose from to make a bigger volume of what I hope will be a really, really good Les Genoux. The 21's really good too, but we're bottling the best barrel, so it's going to be top quality, rather than blending a slightly less good barrel with it and having a bigger volume of a slightly less good wine. Anyway, on to the 17. This is a big year, deep coloured. It was one of those easy years where the vines were there was a reasonably long growing season, but the vines were clearly quite ripe quite early. And at the beginning, we looked at the harvest dates, and it was all over by the end of September. And we had a good yield of really good grapes. And then the wines tasted just fabulously fruit rich from the beginning. That always had this very bright, fresh fruit flavour, which I think still persists at the age that it is now. Mm. And of all the wines here, it's probably the most tannic and the most serious and extracted. And but it's still got a delicacy and a smoothness about it. I'm loving the 17 Domaine of the Bee at the moment. I think it's, you know, it's 15 and the 17 are probably my two favorite kind of for drinking now. We obviously drink quite a lot of it ourselves because we often have half bottles open, and it's quite hard to avoid having a glass of an evening. So there are a few vintages that you leave alone for a few months, and then you go back and open a bottle and they surprise you. But I certainly drink a reasonable amount of the 17 at the moment. So any thoughts and comments about this 17 compared to the others so far?
Well, it's definitely my favourite so far. I don't know how to be more detailed in comments about it, but it's definitely my favourite. So.
Good. And it's certainly got a bit more black fruit, perhaps you might say. Some of the others are quite red fruit focused. This is a bit more, I don't know, dark plum and that kind of thing. I've never been very good or consistent at describing wines in detail. So I also slightly hesitate to suggest things that you will then probably, there's a bit auto-suggestion involved in wine tasting, but I often notice things like orange peel is often a feature of Grenache. Kirsch, you know, that kind of cherry liqueur stuff, particularly on the riper vintages, often have a sort of slightly Kirsch-like character. And then a little bit of that herbal, fennelly licorice stuff going on. Any other thoughts and comments?
Yes, yes. Hear me?
Is that Martin? Your microphone might be causing a bit of feedback. Martin or Chris?
Turn mine off.
Best if you try and keep them off until you want to say something, and then try to remember to turn it on as you say something. I need to put my glasses on at this point because I can't.
I hate to say this about Roussillon because Roussillon is Roussillon, but to me, this vintage has got a beautiful combination of kind of Northern Rhone-like elegance and finesse, but Southern Rhone succulence. And it's not Rhone, but if you're trying to understand this wine from someone who perhaps doesn't know Roussillon, that's how I would explain it.
Yes, and that's a good point, because you know a lot of the people who come to our stand at the Barnes Food Fair, you know, they don't know us and they don't know the wine style, and you need to have some way to explain it. And it's very much easier to explain something by saying it's a bit like something you already know. And I tend to say, Tamlin, I tend to talk about it's somewhere between Châteauneuf-du-Pape and Priorat. We have the same grapes as Priorat, and we have a sort of slaty soil and some altitude and some similarities, although I think Priorat is just sort of distinctly different. But I think it gives a sort of indication of it's not quite Châteauneuf either, and it's not quite even on a line between the two. It's sort of a triangle between the two, but it has a relation with both. And I sometimes, if people don't know Priorat, I say Rioja because they know Rioja, and it actually is on a geographical line between, if you draw a line between Châteauneuf-du-Pape and Rioja, you cross us pretty much. And Rioja has some of the Grenache softness and sometimes the oak characteristics and one or two of the wines. So I think that's quite a helpful thing to say as well. Any other thoughts? I mean, those of you who like our wines, why do you buy them? And what other wines do you like that these remind you of? And interested to hear your thoughts about, and Genoux, why do you buy Genoux over Domaine of the Bee, which is a more expensive wine? What's better about it? Over to you.
This is actually the first time I've tried Le Genoux, so that's why I was keen to do this. Yeah, so it's different from Domaine of the Bee.
It's lighter, I think, and but I'm interested to hear from you.
It's always been lighter, but the standard Domaine of the Bee has become lighter over the years, I think.
Well, certainly a bit, and I think the 2021 will put us back to a slightly bigger style. And I think the last 3 years, 18, 19, and 20, have been a little on the lighter side.
Yeah,
because of the weather and
which I like, because the older ones used to give me a headache when I love them, but they give me headaches.
Yes, well, I confess I sometimes have the same problem. And it's not always overconsumption either. You know, you can have 2 or 3 glasses and then think that was not drinking that much, but I've got a bit of a head the next day. And you know, I think we've extracted the wine less than we used to. I think Richard, who we worked with at the beginning, was very keen on really big, very ripe, sometimes higher than 15%, and very extracted, quite deep colored styles. And I think we've gravitated towards a more natural infusion rather than a kind of extraction, where we don't do too much mashing around as the wine's fermenting. We let the wine sit there. We just punch gently down to soak the grapes. And that means we don't get quite so much color. Some of those things that give you a headache are the things that come out of the skins of the grapes when you kind of work the grapes hard. So that might be part of the reason. Any other thoughts about Les Genoux as a style?
I tend to find that, just hate the word elegance, but they have just a touch more elegance and more layers to that flavor or profile of it. So just think you open it and there's there's just more to come. And I'm actually on the 2017. I'm really intrigued to see how this one will age over the years as well, because it's got that distinctly different, perhaps, style compared to the previous two. So it's an interesting one for me.
It is a bigger style, isn't it? And yeah, there's more color and more tannin. And well, we'll see when we move on, because I think 2017 to 2018 is quite a sort of interruption. One of the things I thought, when I first started, we were working with Richard, and it was really Richard who made the wines. I was working at Waitrose at the time, I think, and I'd try and take a week off or a couple of long weekends during harvest and go out there and sort of interfere. Well, sort of hang around to start with, and then sort of comment, and then start interfering. And I think it was sort of 2010, 2011 before suggestions of mine were taken seriously in any way. And then fairly shortly after that, we actually moved to work with Jean-Marc, because Richard became the employed winemaker at D66, and Dave, whose cellar it was, allowed us to be there for 9, 10 and 11. But from then onwards, he said, did we mind finding somewhere else to work? Because he wanted to sell it for himself, which is entirely reasonable. And he was very good and gave us a couple of years of notice. But when we came to work with Jean-Marc, he was a bit more, okay, look, how do you want to make this wine? And thinking about my ideas. And that's when we started open barrel fermenting. We'd done a couple of times with Richard, at my suggestion, actually. And we carried on doing that with Jean-Marc. And Jean-Marc has now adopted that. There's 70 or 80 barrels a year that get open fermented at Jean-Marc's, of which 10 or 15 are ours. And one of the things we started doing in 2017 for the first time was whole bunch fermenting. So normally you destem the grapes, you have a destemmer that whacks the bunch and knocks all the grapes off, spits the stalks out one end, and then you've got these grapes, you pick out the little tiny bits of stalk that manage to make it through. And you've got sort of whole grapes or crushed grapes. And that's how we used to make all the wine. In fact, we used to crush everything and destem everything. Now what we do is at least a third, getting towards a half of the wine, is whole bunch fermented, which means you stick literally the bucket of grapes into the vat or into the tank, tread it a little bit to get some juice. And then you're fermenting the grapes with the stalks there, which is quite a bit harder to punch down and harder to handle. So you're gentle in the way you work it, but it's given us a style that I think 18, we've got a higher proportion of whole bunch, and 19 and 20, probably a higher proportion still. Normally the barrel that we base Les Genoux on, the main barrel is now whole bunch. And then we have a pressings barrel, which is often the pressings of the Genoux, and there's a block of the back to Genève vineyard that we sometimes press with the Genoux just to get enough to press together. And we use that barrel as well as the main Genoux barrel. So let's taste the 18. Look at the color. Definitely paler. I mean, we haven't got that much left for the 17, but you saw in the picture at the beginning quite how much paler the 18 was. And for me, I don't know, the nose suddenly seems a little bit different. It's a bit sort of yogurty, or it's got a sort of, I don't know, I sometimes describe it as being Pinot Noir-like. And I think that's actually possibly because a lot of Pinot Noirs nowadays use whole bunch fermentation. So it might be just the smell of whole bunch fermentation that I'm smelling that I rather like, and it gives it a sort of mouth-watering edge and a slight savouriness. And it's quite light when you taste it. I'm just flicking to the right slide for the 18. Yeah, we're down to 13.5% alcohol from 15. And this is probably one of the first wines that got really good attention from the press, Tamlin really liked it. Tom Canavan gave it 94 out of 100. We showed it to a few people, and it was, you know, pretty well received. It's a lighter style, but it's got a lovely delicacy and a freshness. And when I was bottling these all in preparation for this tasting, it's the one I sort of the last. We had a sort of half bottle of all of these from the dregs, because when you make 750 mils of wine and you put it into 100 ml bottles, you overfill them, so they got 105 mils or something. You end up with a little bit left from each bottle, which I put together, and I tasted those in the evening. And the one that was emptiest first was the 2018, which is always a good sign. So I just thought it was tasting absolutely lovely, and maybe the 1920 will get there, but they're a little bit younger.
I think it's very interesting, this wine, but it tastes completely different to the one we previously tasted, which was almost like a sort of classic wine with some tannin left. This is you wouldn't believe it was the same wine really from a different year. It's that different to me anyway.
Yes, it's different. It's all, you know, in the lineup, it's suddenly a step change, isn't it? It definitely has a different character to it, and less of that extraction and tannin, and a bit more delicacy, and there's a sort of palate freshness that isn't acidity particularly, but it gives it life and liveliness that perhaps some of the other wines, the earlier ones, have less of. Any other thoughts? Is anyone who actually doesn't like this wine as much and thinks it's not so good, a bit pale and weedy, or are we all fans? We will probably ask everyone to vote at the end. I don't know, top 3 or something like that, which of this lineup, and we'll see what the consensus might be. Any other thoughts? We might have to wait till we get to the end for people to actually say, right, I would definitely like that one best. Tamlin, you at the time, I mean, 2 years ago, you tasted this and gave it a lovely note. I don't know if you can all read what's on the screen there, but some very enthusiastic words from Tamlin and a very good score. What are your thoughts about tasting it again?
Tasting it now, there's something about this that reminds me of Nebbiolo. You know, kind of last time I was talking about Pinot Noir and Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but every time I taste your wines, they are the varieties and the regions that have transparency. Pinot Noir, you know, has an incredible transparency. It always talks about the soil from which it comes, but it has these beautiful silky tannins. Nebbiolo is the same. No matter how, you know, tough Nebbiolo tannins are, they always are transparent. And you've got this cashmere quality, which is, I think, particularly amazing because you come from such a hot region with such big grape varieties. I mean, Carignan, Grenache, these are big varieties, but you somehow in your vineyard, you are getting these cashmere transparent tannins. And yeah, I taste your wines and I always get a sense of standing in a chapel and looking through stained glass windows. So there's always this beautiful clarity of fruit.
Yeah.
Guys, you evoke so well, Tamlin. I love the way you write, and yeah, I struggle to describe wine in quite the same way, but it's wonderful to read it. And I think, you know, among wine writers, there are only a few who write about a wine in such an evocative way. You think, first of all, I want to taste that. And if you know what the wine tastes like, you go, yes, I recognize something about the way the wine is that's, you know, I can see in the description. And, you know, we've been very, very delighted at the fact that, first of all, you like our wine, but secondly, you describe it so beautifully. So thank you. And yeah, well, I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts they want to share. Probably not after hearing Tamlin describing it in that way. Yeah, I'm a big fan of this particular one. I think it's tasting delicious, and quite excited about the next two as well. So let's move on and taste the. I'm just wondering if I got another slide about 2018. Oh, yeah, these are the pictures I took. Can
I ask a question, please, before you move on? Thank you. I mean, I'm thoroughly enjoying this. I think your wines are just Beautiful. But what we've noticed here, we've got lots getting a bit muddled up with all our glasses. Such a difference, even with 5-10 minutes of letting your wines breathe. What do you recommend? And I know you spend they're very full to the brim. It's quite tricky to pour from the bottles. What would you recommend breathing time before you with each of your wines?
Well, so fairly good rule is give it lots of air. I mean, most of the wines, and I'm certainly talking about Domaine of the Bee here, when we started, they were big burly wines, and they were often, if you had a bottle and you had half of the wine and you stuck the cork in and you left it till the next day the wine would be way better. I mean, suddenly it would have opened up, and even after 12 hours, 24 hours of having been having half a bottle taken out and the oxygen had got to the wine, it hadn't oxidized yet, but it had opened in an extraordinary way. So, you know, in fact, I think it says on the back label, you know, it needs plenty of air. Let it out of the bottle in advance, pour it into a jug, give it some air, and it will repay that. And I think that's true of Les Genoux as well. The flavors are a bit more delicate, so I wouldn't splash it around because the danger is that those lovely delicate aromatic flavors and herbal and orange peel and things like that blow off, and then you just get some fruit left behind. But I think they do repay time in the glass, and that's probably true of quite a lot of wines. But there is also the factor that as you drink it, you've consumed a bit more and your mindset changes, and you know, is it your state that's changed or is it the wine? And we never really know. A bit of both, I think, but I definitely think they do age well, and that they do decant. They do need decanting. I think it's a good idea to decant them. You know, I show them at events and I don't any longer decant them because it's a lot of hassle to take 6 decanters with you and make sure you decant it carefully and do it at the right time. And then you got to open another bottle and you don't have time to decant it. So we tend to pour them straight from the bottle. Maybe we shouldn't. We should decant them off more often. Yeah, but thank you for asking that. That's a really good question. So I would advise decanting in a general principle. It changes wines. And young wines particularly it'll just speed up the acceleration of development of flavor a bit. Old wines, on the other hand, I would often not decant, or only decant them for big sediment, and you need to separate the wine from the sediment. Otherwise you waste the last couple of glasses because it gets cloudy. And that's a good reason to decant, but then you often decant those wines just before you drink them. So if they're 20, 30 years old, it's better to let them open up in the glass than let them open up in the decanter. And by the time that you pour them in the glass, they've kind of gone over the hill a bit.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, this slide I just want to mention our lovely dog Otto, who died about a year ago, February 22. But he was a loyal companion. He would often come out with me for harvest. So we obviously lived in London, and Amanda works full time in London, and I'm now a consultant, so I can do what I like to more of an extent. So I can pop out to France more often. So I'm probably there 10 or 12 weeks a year, but we'll often drive out twice a year, usually summertime and then for harvest. And driving means we can take our lovely dog with us. So most of the times at harvest, I'd be there for 5 weeks, and Amanda would come out for a week or a couple of long weekends. But I'd be there with Otto, and he was a very good grape sampler. He basically spent most of his harvest just wandering around snaffling grapes. And if you've owned a dog and you read the instruction manual, you're not meant to give them grapes or chocolate. There's all sorts of things that they become severely ill apparently if they eat. But Otto once ate 1.5 kilos of chocolate. We took him to the vet, so he had his stomach pumped. He was absolutely fine. And the next time he ate quite a lot of chocolate, I don't think we bothered taking him to the vets, and he was absolutely fine. And
I think it depends on the dog.
I'm not recommending. I'm not.
Please,
not medical advice. Don't feed your dogs chocolate. But they're not meant to eat grape.
The dogs have also got an incredibly discerning nose. We're using dogs for oncology, and all sorts at the moment.
Yeah.
Did you notice that Otto had a discerning taste and deciphered a vintage for you?
I would like to think so, but no. He'd eat anything.
He would go from a bull poo straight onto a grape. So he did not have a discerning nose.
No. I've got a nice couple of pictures where I gave him a cork to sniff. Just, but yeah, he would just wander around, just picking up grapes that fall on the ground and eating them, and most of his poos would be just full of grape skins.
Enough.
Enough. He probably eats a couple of kilos a year. So let's move on to the 2019. Now, this wine I was delighted to enter it into the Global Grenache Masters, which is a competition run by the drinks business, and they have single grape variety competitions where, I don't know, 150 or 200 wines get entered. So they're not the enormous global competitions that Decanter and International Wine Challenge are, which have 16,000, 18,000 entries across all categories. But they, for one category or one grape variety, they announce that they're opening a competition. And I thought, well, you know, let's enter our Grenaches. And this one came top equal. Actually, another one had the same score. And it was given 97 out of 100. And quite candidly, I wouldn't give it 97. I'd give it about 95. I think it was slightly overpraised, but I think it's really nice wine. Tamlin liked it quite a lot as well. And it's a little bit oakier. I found that it had, maybe it's passed a bit now, but compared to some of the other wines, a fairly obvious oak flavour, which some of the other ones don't. But
cherry pie.
Lovely oak, and there's a sort of vanilla flavour, and Amanda's getting cherries.
Almost cherry pie.
It's very mouth-watering and fresh. It's got lots of promise and lots of lusciousness, but as Tamlin said, that kind of cashmere tannin softness. Little bit of oak on the finish. I don't think it's quite ready yet. I think it will evolve beautifully over a bit more time. But a really lovely wine. We don't have a lot left. I think I put 179, but that was when I looked it up a couple of weeks ago, and we sold quite a lot recently. So we haven't. I think we've got about 50 bottles in the warehouse here, and I think there's a few, maybe 100 or so in France that I'm going to ship over.
Much pinker colour than that one.
Yeah, well, it's younger, so it's got a bit more pinkness to it. Anyone want to comment on the 2019 in comparison to the 2018? It
was interesting you said you didn't think it was quite ready, but your wines are very soft, even if they're young. They're not, I mean, if you had something that like Tannat, you know, you probably couldn't drink it for 4 or 5 years. It would be too dry on the palate. But the only one who've really tasted any tannin is the 2017. This has got a lot of fruit. So, I mean, you can easily drink it at this age. I mean, maybe you're saying it will improve if you leave it a couple of years, but it's still a very pleasant wine to drink.
Well, yeah, no, thank you. And honestly, when I was last out there tasting the 2022s, so I was there until the wines were pretty much until they were pressed. Then I came back to England. I went out in late November, early December for 3 or 4 days just to plan the blends for the previous year, and tasted all the barrels again. And I was thinking these wines at a month old were so delicious. We should just bottle them now. Really, particularly the Genoux barrels. I mean, it's really delicate, pale coloured, extraordinarily precise and beautiful sort of wild strawberry flavours with a mountain herbs and those lovely kind of red pastel fruits you get in Switzerland. Are sort of, I don't know what fruit they're made from. Just delicious. And I just thought, well, why don't we just bottle it now? And it's so good.
Did you?
Did I bottle some?
Yeah.
No, no. Too early. I mean, yeah, you've got to wait till the malolactic's finished and a few other things. We could choose to bottle an early barrel just to see how that compares, give it less oak and just focus more on the fruit. I think the problem comes that people who want to pay a reasonable amount of money for a bottle of wine tend to want to feel that it's, you know, mature and rounded and serious and had some oak, and it's harder to get people to pay that kind of money for a very young wine that's just literally just bottled, because the perception is the wine should age and should be tasted when they're older. And that same wine will, you know, it'll be the 22 Genoux, and you know, some of us will be keeping it for 10 years, and it may be beautiful 10 years later. So it's a bit premature to say we've got to drink it now, but there's something about fresh young wine that really can be delicious and very easy to drink straight away. And it's certainly going to be a low tannin style. And I think, you know, all our wines will be moving in that direction. 21, the one that's coming up next, is a naturally bigger, darker coloured, punchier wine with a bit more alcohol. It's going to be 14, I think, 14% rather than 13. It's quite hard to control Grenache when it wants to ripen and put sugar on, but this vineyard is a north-facing slope, and it's a cooler spot, and it's always the last to harvest, and it is, yeah, rarely does it get towards 15, whereas the other vineyard can get to 17 if you don't watch it. You know, we tend to pick between 15 and 16. We had a couple of barrels over 16 this year. So Domaine of the Bee is going to be quite punchy from 2022. But the Genoux vineyard was just picked later, is going to be quite delicate. And it's strange to have two vineyards so close together with the same grape variety in them and to have really quite different flavor profiles. What else did I put on here from 21? Just a couple of people here on these slides. A guy on the left is one of Jean-Marc's vineyard guys who is called Manu, and he's not looking after our vines on a regular basis, but he runs the picking team and brings them up for harvest. And again, lovely chap. So Jean-Marc is now farming about 300 hectares. Our 4 hectares are sort of slightly annoying part of Jean-Marc's universe, because we're always a bit different and we want to do things in a slightly different way. And obviously I can only achieve what Jean-Marc's prepared to let us do. So I sometimes have ideas and he goes, no, we can't do that. And we're having some interesting discussions about farming at the moment, because he's moving towards, he's tried quite substantial trials of organic wine, and he's been doing it for a few years now, and he's, I think, fairly convinced that organic isn't the right solution for where we are, just straight organic farming. But he's got quite excited by the idea of regenerative farming, which I'm learning a lot about at the moment. And essentially that means no ploughing of the soil, no turning over of the soil, allowing plants to grow in the soil and controlling them through manual means or grazing, in order to keep life in the soil and have more soil organic matter and carbon in the soil. And you know, I hope we're going to gradually move some of the vineyards that we've got towards that way of farming. And there's some practical reasons why some things are easy and possible and other things are impossible. So we'll work out how to do that in the coming years. But you know, I can't ask for Jean-Marc to farm our vineyards in a way that's totally different from the way he's farming the rest of them, for obvious reasons. And then on the right we have Dominique, who's he's Jean-Marc's kind of trusted harvest winemaker. He has a big vineyard up near Narbonne, providing big volumes of quite inexpensive grapes because he farms it very efficiently and they have quite big yields. And he's applying a lot of the basic grapes for Jean-Marc's more everyday wines, which he sells at, you know, I guess £8 to £12 a bottle. And when it's harvest time, Dominique then comes and spends 2 or 3 months at Saint Roch and is in charge of the Saint Roch cellar and keeps an eye on our barrels. And obviously I'm there most of the time, but when I go away before the end of, or just as the harvest is finishing, he kind of finishes off the wines and makes sure they go to sleep in the right barrels, which he's just done for this year. So maybe it's now time, because it's now 1:15, it's time to trace the 2020. So Tamlin, I don't think you've seen this before, because I haven't sent you any bottles. We haven't sent many out, but I did send one to Matthew Jukes not that long ago, and he's included it in one of the best wines he tasted in 2022. And he's a prolific taster, tastes a lot of wine, and he gave us 19 out of 20. And he's produced this publication called The Finest 50. It's the best 50 wines he tasted this year, and he's given us a lovely note and a great score. So it's really wonderful when you discover people who, you know, whose palates you respect, who are kind of tasters who taste a large volume of different wines, who actually go, that is a really good wine, I really like that. And it's not to do with, really, it's not about winemaking, it's about this vineyard. That's what this fruit tastes so good because it comes from a wonderful vineyard. And it's maybe even lighter still. One small confession is that part of the lightness of this wine comes from it raining quite a lot during harvest. And this is Sam. Sam is joining us for the last couple. Say hello to everyone.
How are we all? Looking lovely as ever.
Yeah, so we had to dodge the rainstorms during this vintage. In 19 it rained a bit before harvest, and 20 Sam's going, that was really nice. It's an endorsement from Sam as well. That's his tasting note. We had periodic rainstorms, and obviously you have to decide when it rains. Do you pick straight afterwards when the grapes might, if you pick the next day, you might get the grapes off before they swell right up, because all the water's gone into the ground and gradually gets soaked into the vine. The vine pulls the water up and fills the berries. So 2 days after a rainstorm, there's a bit of dilution. So we track the sugar ripening. You know, your sugar's going from 12.5 to 13.5 to 14, and you're thinking, right, we need to pick. And then it pours with rain. And then the day after you go and do the sugars and it's down to 13 because the grapes are diluted. And you think, well, do we leave them a week to concentrate up again, or do we pick? And that's usually based on the forecast. So when it's going to be dry for a week, you think we'll leave them 4 or 5 days, let it dry out, let the grapes shrivel back a bit, lose some of that excess water, and then we'll pick. But in 2020, we thought, no, it's going to start raining again. And it did. We were very happy we picked when we did, because it poured with rain a couple of days afterwards. And we'd actually probably have lost the crop because the grapes might have burst. But we had a little bit of dilution. So we've ended up with a wine that would have been probably 14%, dropped down to 13. But it's got a beautiful delicacy and a freshness. And I'm very, very pleased with it. So I quite like the idea of it raining just before vintage now. It sounds like a bad thing, but and these 19 and 20, both these years, we had a little bit of dilution from rain.
That tastes to me almost like a good quality English still red wine, actually. It's quite tart, but
David, interesting observation. I mean,
tastes like some young wines taste very unsophisticated, don't they? But there's a nice roundness to this, but it's very different to all of the others.
It's a step even lighter, I think.
Yeah.
18 and 19 have both got a step towards that, but this is a further step. And I mean, a little while ago, I might have been slightly offended to be compared to an English red wine.
I don't think it should be, actually, because they're getting a lot better.
There's some really good ones now, really, really good ones, but they tend to be really expensive. That's the one downside, is the really good ones are 35, 40 quid a bottle. But, you know, so's this. So fair enough. You know, hats off to them. Danbury Ridge are making some really, really good Pinot Noir, and Gusbourne and Chapel Down do some really good ones. And yeah, there's a number of great producers.
I would move into English red territory with this.
Yes.
But the elegance is stunning. It's stunning, absolutely breathtakingly elegant. And you've got roses and silk right throughout this whole wine. And to me, you're moving much more onto the kind of spectrum of Pinot Noir, Burgundy. But I don't like to compare Roussillon with other regions and with other wines, but this is kind of the cashmere and silk of Roussillon. So I'd veer away, but from comparing with any other region. But I'm with Matthew on the 19 out of 20. I'm absolutely with him. I think everything that he writes there, I agree with. I think that this is a nerve-tinglingly, stunningly beautiful wine, and I think the best Les Genoux ever.
Wow.
Simon, thank you. That's lovely to hear, and I'm pleased with it. I think it's delicious, and I think it's got a lot of promise as well. I think right now I love the 18, but I've always thought that the 20 was better than the 19, and I was quite surprised when the drinks business gave the 19 97 points. So I thought, as I said, I think that's slightly overpraising it. They didn't give, I did enter the 20 and they didn't give it such a high score. So I haven't published the score they gave it. Obviously a very ignorant bunch of tasters that year. But no, the truth is you enter your wine to a competition and some days they just don't show well. It's a bit like expecting your children to behave. Sometimes they're amazing and you think, how on earth did they do that? And other times they're awful. So obviously the bottle we sent into that didn't particularly appeal to the judges who tasted it, but I think it's a better wine. Tamlin, I think you agree with me. Yeah, I'm very, very, very pleased with it. And I think the 21 is going to be lovely as well, but it'll be bigger and darker and a bit chunkier, a bit more like the 17 perhaps. So I very much appreciate your opinion when we get around to that. There won't be much of it, so you'll have to grab your case early. Yeah, no, I mean, so can I just sort of throw the floor open,
We'll
if you
take it
like,
off slideshare then.
yeah, let's stop the sharing of the slides.
Okay.
Now I can see everybody. What would be lovely is to say, I think it might be fair to divide the wine into the first three and the last three. Yeah, do you want to go and grab it? Yeah, it's somewhere. So it's probably in the office. So Amanda's just noticed the battery is looking a bit catastrophically low, and we don't want to suddenly get cut off. So hopefully she's going to go find the power cable. But yeah, I think if it's fair to say the 18, 19, and 20 have got pale colours, a bit of whole bunch, a bit more delicacy, and the 17 is the big rich wine, and the two before that are in a slightly richer mould. It'd be really interesting to know if we just decide, do you like the second three or the first three, and have all of your opinions. So let's do it by hands, because I can now see all the screens. Chris, I'm very glad you could join us. I saw you didn't join at the beginning, but I'm glad to see you've joined us now. But anyone who wants to have their vote counted, do turn their camera on. So who thinks that the first three are their preferred group of three? Got Charles and Julie, and who else? Anyone else? And we have Jonathan and his party. All of them are preferring the first three, and that seems to be it. Can't see any other hands up. So second three. Everyone else's hands are up. So there's maybe some. I can't really see Chris and Chris's hand. So which one are you voting for, Chris? Chris George. Sorry.
Okay. Yes.
I can't see Chris, but anyway, strong endorsement for the second three. I mean, I think it's a slightly, I've asked you to make a sort of decision one way or the other, and you might say they're very equal, or you might radically prefer them. I don't know, but it seems that the style we're moving towards, a lighter, fresher, more delicate style, is really appreciated. That's great to hear.
And we're going back to the old style.
Well, that's a bit, partly it's a vintage constraint, but we're definitely going to keep whole bunch, doing more whole bunch. It's a very interesting thing we did. So in 2017 or 18, I think it was 18, we did an experiment where we took from the same vineyard the same fruit, and we divided one barrel whole bunch and a barrel exactly the same fruit destemmed, and then we followed them. We measured the sugars and they were pretty similar, and then we followed them as they fermented, and we did that for two different vineyards, both of the Grenache vineyards. So we had a pair of barrels from the Cuvée d'Oie and a pair of barrels from the Bac de Genève vineyard. And both of the whole bunch barrels were 0.6 or 0.7% alcohol lower than the other destemmed barrel after they'd finished fermenting. And, you scratch your head and think, why could that be? And I think the explanation is twofold. One is you're introducing stalks and all the stems into the wine, and they've got sap in them. And the sap of those stems has got water in it, and not as much sugar as the grapes. So you're introducing some liquid that isn't sugary, so that lowers the alcohol a bit. But then also when you throw away the stems, they've got a lot of alcohol soaked in them. So they're taking out some of the alcohol that you've created in the fermentation. And the net effect of that is you have about 0.7, 0.6, 0.7 degrees of alcohol lower. So you go from 14.5 to 13.8 between the two barrels. And we're trying not to be too alcoholic, because I think no one wants to drink more alcohol than they should. And while we do make some big alcohol styles, it's quite nice to be able to make the Genoux in a style that's a bit lighter. So I'm definitely looking to try and make it as 13.5% rather than 15. And if this method of whole bunch helps, then I'm keen to enlist it. And I also think that the tannin and extract and freshness you get sort of pithiness and a grapefruity freshness, bitterness that is a very pleasant, refreshing characteristic, and I think it's what gives these last three wines something special.
Can I just ask a quick question? Do you think that you'll ever repeat 2017? Because of the 6 we tasted, that one was really quite different and very refined. And I know you said it was kind of an exceptional year, but do you in any of your later vintages, do you see the same qualities?
I think 2021 is a bit like 2017. deeper colors, really good fruit expression, clean, ripe fruit, no disease or problems. Yeah, and I think, you know, looking back, 2011 was similar. So I think those three vintages share something. 22, I haven't made my mind up yet, because I think the Grenache is absolutely lovely. And the Carignan, when I went back in December, although I liked it at harvest time and thought it was really promising, the fruit tasted great, I didn't like the wines as much. And it might just be a stage they're going through, but I think the Carignan will be kind of average quality and the Grenache will be extremely good from 2022. And we'll see what we make in blends. It's actually, I probably should warn you, I've got a couple of odd things coming up in 2021. So first of all, we had our harvest weekend, which we'd repeated every year, and we even did it through COVID, but one year we only had 4 people who managed to come. We officially cancelled the weekend, and then 4 people rang up and said, we're going to come anyway, because we don't care that the flights are cancelled and they have to get all the hoops to get there. We're going to get there anyway. So they came and had a lovely time. But yes, last year we had a big showing. And why did I start talking about this? Oh yes, from the 21 vintage. So we made a barrel in 2021 that is now being bottled as the Worker Bees Cuvée. Martin, were you there at 21? I can't remember when you came out. No. Chris, you were there, weren't you? Chris James, Chris and Silla. Hello guys. And so, I mean, anyone else who wants to come in 2023, please do come. We've got 6 or 8 people signed up already, but there's room for more. So we'd love to see you there. And you get to pick a small part of the vineyard and crush a barrel and follow that barrel over the following couple of months.
Do you know what date it is, or do you let us know near?
Yes, we've decided we booked it quite early this year, because last year we couldn't get the date we wanted. We had to go a week later, which proved to be difficult because we picked most of our grapes by then. And then the grapes I left to pick, the wild boar ate most of them. So we didn't have a lot to pick. So this year it's the 29th and 30th, or the 30th and 1st of September into October. It's that weekend. It is on the website, so if you look under events, it's available there. And we'd love to see all of you.
Can I ask you a question about the district? Well, of course. Apart from you, who are producing your own domain and selling it, what does everybody else do with their grapes and their wine? Do they blend them, or what happens?
So, I mean, really good question. It's traditionally an area, like a lot of the south of France, where the cooperative winery dominates. And so most people who are a grower, who have some land, grow their grapes, take them to the co-op, get their docket for the weight of grapes they've delivered. And then a few months later, they get paid whatever the going rate is. And it's not very added value. They're making a fairly generic, medium grade product. Our particular area used to be famous for a fortified wine. So the growers used to be actually getting quite good money for their grapes, but that's sort of declined. But more and more people have started making interesting wine sort of independently or privately, and there are a lot. And it's one of the reasons that Tamlin is excited about the Roussillon as a region, because there really are a lot of people who've come. Some are locals who've the children of growers who've developed their own project, and quite a lot are incomers from northern France or from South Africa or from Mexico, or there's a lot of people who've come in, a few English, German, or Swiss, quite a wide variety of people have come and bought land there. So there's 100+ really good estates making really interesting wine, from our scale, which is pretty much the smallest, up to 150 hectares. The D66 is about 120 hectares now. Domaine Lafarge is 300 hectares. So there's quite a range of people, from tiny to big producers. And then there's the other category called négociants, who are people who buy bulk and blend wines, and sometimes make some of them and produce brands. So people like Gérard Bertrand buys a lot of wine in the Roussillon. And then there's the cooperatives. So that it's quite a wide variety, but there's more and more small individual producers. Where were we? So yes, the 2021 vintage, we have a barrel of the Worker Bees Cuvée. We also have 2 barrels of experimental wine that I'm trying to negotiate the legalities of selling, because they're not legally going to be called wine, because I started fermenting. Tamlin, keep this under your hat, please. No publicity of this until we've actually got them bottled and legally labelled. was quite intrigued by the idea that herb flavors can arrive in a wine through attaching to the skin of the grape, and quite interested by the idea you might plant herbs deliberately between the rows of vines to actually to perfume the grapes with a flavor. But I went a step further with a couple of barrels and just soaked some herbs in the wine as it fermented. So we're really making like a vermouth, a herb influenced wine, but not a sweet and not a fortified vermouth, just wine with a little bit of herbs soaked in it as it ferments. And it's produced some really interesting flavors. We've got about 250 bottles of each. They'll have to be called aromatized wine, like a vermouth, and sold in a different tax bracket. And there's a few complications, and it's possible we'll err on the wrong side of a legal line and find that we can't sell it after all. But they may be coming your way in about 6 months' time.
Justin, I'm assuming that by herbs, you're not talking about anything along the CBD line.
Not that kind of herb, Tamlin, although that is not a bad idea. So thank you for that thought. No, we're talking about a bag of 200 grams of thyme in a muslin bag. There's lots of wonderful smelling thyme. You walk around and you stand on a thyme bush and you get this incredible rush of thyme aroma. And the thyme barrel is really quite marked, even though we only use 200 grams in a whole barrel. There's really quite a strong smell of thyme in that one. And the rosemary, we used 500 grams, so 2.5 times the amount, because the rosemary bushes are bigger and heavier and more weight. But there's less obvious rosemary flavor in that wine. But yeah, we have a rosemary and thyme. I was going to call them Scarborough Fair number 3 and Scarborough Fair number 4 as a very subtle mention to see if people got it, but I decided to call them Romerin and Thym, and they've got a little sprig of the herb on the label. And I hope they'll be interesting and intriguing, and maybe you'll want to try them. We'll sell them as sets of 2, so you can buy one of each and see if you like them. And yeah, we'll see.
Right.
Hands up, who wants to buy one?
A few.
Good, sold. That's good to know. Well, listen, it's now well past 8:30. It's been lovely to have the chance to taste with all of you. I mean, you are all of you supporters of ours, some really quite recent who found us in the last year or two, many long-standing supporters, many who've been to our house and tasted with us on several occasions, and those of you who haven't yet, we're looking forward to inviting you and getting to know you. So please do come. Thank you so much for your support and your enthusiasm and for joining in this tasting. And you know, it's lovely to feel that this first vineyard that we bought on a whim all those years ago is making wine of this quality that's really well appreciated by everybody. So I'm really grateful for your attendance and hope you've enjoyed this evening. We will put the recording somewhere if you want to watch it again for some strange reason. I have one emergency set of samples left that I was keeping in case anyone didn't have any at the last minute. But if you have a desperate need to send it to a friend, please let me know, because I could post it to you, or I'll drink it myself in the next few days.
You might share it with your wife.
Well, obviously,
Thank you.
everything I share with my wife. So look, thank you all very much. That's fantastic, kind of you to join us. And let's say good night now and see you all at tasting one day soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks very
Brilliant.
much.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
Thanks, Justin.
Oh. Don Pagno. Oh,
And
yeah,
did you see
A few comments. I might just do a screenshot of the comments page.
so he was at it.
he was giving the wine